Hi, Sublation Media viewers, listeners, readers. Welcome to a new show called The Last of the Millennials, in which Stefan, Nathan and I talk about millennial topics, games, the weird corners of the internet and so on. Every Sunday, 8 o'clock on Twitch, but occasionally we're putting out our bigger interviews on the main channel as well. This one is with Paolo Pedercini, probably in my opinion the best and most prominent socialist games designer in the indie gaming world. For patrons as well, we've got an extra hour in which we play two of Paolo's games and discuss them as we play them, which was super fun. So Sublation Media patrons get onto that as well for the Parrot Room, and hope you enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to Sublation Media podcast with us. What are we? What are we going to call ourselves, Nathan, again?
I believe it's Last of the Millennials, as we're going with.
I like this. And this is going to be, we're on Twitch every Sunday, so people should check us out there. And we've been mostly talking about video games, but other millennial topics, perhaps, as well.
Other such millennial stuff. The stuff the young people are talking about.
Yeah. Young people like us.
Goblins.
Yeah. And yeah, delighted today to be joined by Paolo Pedercini, who, many gamers will know, is the games designer of Malaya Industria, has made loads of games. I'm sure people have played them. Oligarchy, to build a mousetrap. What have you played?
Bible, even.
Did you play that, Stefan?
10-second Bible. There was other. I like your protest games, the physical games as well, the ones to play in person. Those are incredibly creative.
Thank you for having me.
Actually, Paolo, I first heard of you because when I was in Hong Kong in, I think, 2015, one of my third-year students wrote a dissertation about to build a better mousetrap. And how this was a kind of you've been global inspiration to socialists all over the place.
I'm appreciated by nerds, but PhDs and professors. Which I don't know if it's great.
And I'm just like a flash game nerd, so like I started with Every Day the Same Dream, like way back.
Okay, that's better. Ooh. That's better. No.
Yeah, I was going to say I played Oligarchy and the McDonalds Game when I was a child, and then
the McDonald's.
I just played them because they were good games with no awareness that you were.
Yeah, they were just fantastic
because they were political or whatever. They were just fun games.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Same dream. Is that the one where or is that Every Day the Same Night? You jump off a cliff at the end. This sort of.
It's a cyclical thing, right? Like you do it a few times. I don't want to spoil it. But that is.
You jump off the building. Yeah.
It is something that can happen. You see yourself jumping off the building, I believe, if I remember correctly.
But Paolo's also writes about games and has written an extremely interesting piece, Gaming Under Socialism, which is some years ago now, but which is kind of influential, which you can also read at malayaindustria.org. But I guess what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is this connection between gaming and socialism, because, Paolo, you're a overtly admitted lefty who's also a game designer, which is kind of unusual, I suppose, or at least during a small group of people. So to think about like what the relationship between games and socialism is, and also to think about how you see your own role as a games designer being part of that kind of thing. So I don't know. Let's maybe just start with obvious stuff. Like, how did you which way round was it for you? Were you a gamer first and a socialist second, or the other way around?
Yes, both. I think I was a gamer first, and then I became radicalized, and then I kind of like dropped games in order to focus on playing a anarcho-punk band and comics and
awesome.
Political activism within a party, and then I kind of like went back to games with that. So awesome. In kind of like a weird boomerang trajectory. And I'm talking about, since you were mentioning millennials and generational issues, I'm talking about early 2000 here. Like I started in 2003. That's why you can say I played your games when I was a child, despite the fact that we were probably not much younger than me.
I was 9 in 2003.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. yeah, I think in terms of like how you get to politics or like leftism, those like 10, 15 years can be like really crucial because you probably all entered the work place after the 2008 crisis. Yes. And that was probably the part of the process of radicalization of the millennials, right? Whereas back in my days, few years before, it was definitely a much more, I would say, like intellectual, ethical, perhaps rebellion, rather than being like, oh shit, like in front of me, I have the failure of neoliberalism, and how it's failing me personally, even if I'm, relatively privileged in the first world and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you were always working in games, and then when you became radicalized, as you put it, you then immediately thought you had to combine these two things, because I suppose what's often the case is that they remain kind of separate.
Right. Yeah. Well, I would say like when I started, I was basically doing propaganda for a party for like like a party in Italy, and so I was doing like websites and graphic design and things like that. And so for a campaign, I decided to make a game in order to launch a website of a particular section of this party. So it was basically a viral game, and I kind of like enjoyed it. There was like a bit of positive feedback in that, and so it kind of like I spun off that thing into a project that I thought was going to be like a quick media gesture for like like a couple of years, and it turned out that there was quite a lot to explore, and I'm still doing that.
Awesome.
So what was your very first game, Paolo?
So the very first game is referred as Tema Tipico, and it was originally made for, it's basically a Tamagotchi. It's got like 3 buttons, but the virtual pet is a worker, kind of like a precarious worker. And it was made in occasion of a referendum that we lost, I believe, and it was for the extending essentially rights, certain rights, especially the right to be fired with a just cause, to workers in companies with less than 16, something like that, 16 employees. Yeah, very specific Italian issue, I guess, labor issue.
I think probably not as specific as you think, actually. I think startup culture has a lot of this problem that we see today. Like, to this very day, I mean, I worked at a company that hired apprentices. So it was very much a similar thing, but instead of hiring in number, like it wasn't a number thing, they hired up to 60 people by the end. It was about taking advantage of like a certain loophole in the law to basically take advantage of a thing called an apprenticeship levy.
Also, they pay you pathetically.
Yeah, obviously. So it was, the numbers were what they were paying us as opposed to how many there were. They managed to get away with paying us like £3 an hour. Which,
right. But at that point, I was gravitating in the kind of network in northern Italy that sort of like started a conversation around precarity, or was like center of the conversation about precarity, and this sort of like double tier of even in places where you have a pretty decent union, you still have all the new generation they are entering in a precarized sort of like situation. And so I was like very into that. That was my situation as well.
And this is what I'm saying is, when I was obviously a lot younger, you didn't know what to expect coming into the industry. There weren't necessarily people looking out for you and telling you where and how to organize properly, how to go to a union, how to contact citizens' advice and go through a tribunal. It was very much a hard knock for me of having to learn that by myself.
Right.
And I mean, one of the things that, I mean, I'll come more to your article in a little bit, but like one of the things that's really interesting to me about your points is that, you're often focused on the structure of the industry rather than the games itself, right? So like, I think another person who does this is Mariam Didsgalvate, who I know we're both friends of, Paolo, she kind of argues that basically You can't celebrate a game for having a strong female lead character when it was made by underpaid Chinese women in a factory in the Philippines or whatever, or in China. Like, this is also part of your kind of argument, Paolo, and your approach is that really you're interested in the question of the industry itself, and like you know, part of your writing about the game industry without bosses and so on is about this question of like how do we have socialism in games that is actually interested not just in the game itself that we're playing, but a reform of the industry in a broader sense, right?
Yeah, yes and no. I think that's part of the conversation and has been become more prominent in the conversation. Like not just like what the games are saying, but also like, you know, how the games are made and how, you know, people who make games are treated and so on. And I think that is not just like a left concern. It's also like, you know, liberal kind of concern, at least here in the United States. And I'm obviously paying attention to it, also considering that my position is not in the industry. I'm kind of like the intellectual that floats around because I teach in an art school. So I'm much more invested in the content of the game rather than the production process, just because I'm disconnected from that. So there is a limit to the kind of commentary that I can give on the industry because I'm just not part of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, right. I mean, so like to go to this point then, like, do you sort of, you think that the game, like games themselves, you know, they are what? They're an ideological vehicle. I mean, because one of the things in your article is that, like, you know, you start by saying that, like, you know, you can't really imagine, you know, a socialist country having a great flourishing games industry, even if they, you know, do other technological things. Like, it does seem that games are very much like part of capitalism. So, like, how do we like reconcile this thing? Like, on the one hand, you think games can push a socialist agenda, but on the other hand, they seem a particularly capitalist thing, right? So how to sort of think that situation through, I guess.
Right. Well, I think that when we think about the sort of like Cold War era socialist countries, we don't think about video games. Obviously, we know that there were like video games in the Soviet Union, but they were kind of like knockoffs of the Western ones, and they were very expensive. There were like some interesting things about those games, but they weren't definitely like the peak of Soviet technology. Obviously, in part that is sort of like the problem of envisioning, I guess, that games are like kind of like natively very, very deeply embedded in late capitalism. One could say that late capitalism in video games kind of like start at the same point in 1974, when that's both the canonical beginning of the post Fordist restructuring, and when the Atari becomes mainstream. So like there is like an alignment in there. I think that said, we can still like exercise our imagination. I think it's worth to exercise our imagination and imagine like how games would exist, and how they would be made in a different society that doesn't have private property, or that has like some degree of socialization, not necessarily far-fetched utopia, but maybe even like how would it happen in a transitional sort of like state? And that's kind of like what I tried to do in that article, Games Under Socialism.
I mean, I was thinking a very cynical point might be that in a utopia, what would the use for gamers be if everything was perfect? I mean, obviously, I suppose there would be games, but they wouldn't necessarily. It would just be reality, right? You would be playing games all the time. It would just.
Yeah, that's
you can eat the most grapes.
I didn't go that far to say that. Yeah, like maybe like the need
Yeah,
for escapism wouldn't be. I think it will still need some degree of escapism, after a long, terrible meeting.
You suggested in the article that we might escape from socialism back to some kind of like hyper-capitalist,
I think so,
like
actually.
an escape valve.
Yeah.
It might be almost the opposite. Like the opposite of what you're seeing now, that a lot of like, there is definitely a trend of idyllic, chill games like, Animal Crossing and things like that are like, they're not like, they are still pretty capitalist in their core, but they still like have the vibe of like, oh, what if the world was actually nice and people sort of like helped each other and you had like a meaning. And that's one of the arguments of the, I would say like the advocates of games as a medium, as a good thing, as a good progressive thing, is that the games, they're sort of like giving you this glimpse into a world in which your actions make sense and you're not essentially alienated and you are in control of your life, right? So maybe the opposite way would be like, if everything else is perfect, the games will be more like a valve to give vent to the more like dark, primate, domineering kind of instinct. I think that's an entirely possible situation.
I mean, it's interesting the way you're putting that, because I mean, one of the things that I want to ask about is like, you argue for directly, a kind of democratic socialism. You also made a game, I think it's called Democratic Socialism Simulator, played on my phone a few years ago. I think people should get that. It's like available. You can just download that. It's real fun.
I watched somebody very confusedly playing it. That was incredible. Like they had I don't think they even knew what like democratic socialism was. They were just playing it to see what it was. And they were just like, okay, this is just choosing policy. And I was like, yeah, great. Like, you're getting it. Here we go.
I should say the title of that game is a bit of a clickbait in that it doesn't simulate democratic socialism, but maybe more like the next step toward that possibility. And so you end up kind of like dealing with things that are more squarely in the realm of social democracy. Although like at the very end stage of the game, you can get to kind of more advanced than what any country, even like, Nordic countries, have achieved these days.
But I suppose this was partly going to be my question. I mean, so some of our listeners probably are democratic socialists, and some are, critical of democratic socialism in the sense that they would consider themselves to be sort of far to the left of that, I suppose. So, I think it's interesting to sort of think about this, and like, so in your, like, I mean, maybe it's worth actually saying what you actually mean by that. Like, why do you, Paolo, think democratic socialism is desirable, and what is democratic socialism in your mind? And how did you then try and use games to explore or push this idea that this is something we should want and work towards?
Yeah, I'll try to ground it on the game itself, to not be like, hey, listen, what I think. The game is basically representing a hypothetical presidency and government, like democratic socialist government. Imagine sort of like Bernie Sanders styles, AOC, DSA in the United States, kind of today in this, if not this the previous political cycle, the next political cycle. So very, very near future, somewhat realistic, based on proposals and policies that are technically possible. Maybe, but on a budgetary level, not exactly, and not all at the same time, but they are like essentially all like pretty realistic things that could potentially happen if it was political will, and that are already, into some extent, either on the table already, proposed, or already enacted in some countries, or at some point in time in some states, and so on. So it's very like grounded in that, the reality of the United States. And to just leap to the more abstract question is that that is sort of like representing what I think like my read of democratic socialism right now in the United States, which is this is what we do now. We try to get to the socialist utopia by the way of democratic socialism and essentially like a social democracy. Like we want to get much further than social democracy, but that is the most logical way to get there, because we are in a liberal democracy. As for now, maybe in a couple of years we will not, and I wouldn't. And so like that will be a bit of a negotiation, right? And the other thing is obviously like the history of the history of the word socialism in the United States might be quite different from the perception in Europe. There is a socialist tradition in the United States that is actually pretty good. There are like mayors that have defined themselves as socialists. There are like movements and so on. It doesn't have the sort of like the baggage that communism has, or like communist movements or parties have, right? So at some point in the last 10 years or so, there was the rather conscious decision in a certain circle of the U.S. left to adopt that and to reclaim that term, democratic socialism, also knowing that, people like Martin Luther King in their, later years defined themselves for democratic socialism, just that way as a way to separate yourself from the non-democratic instances of socialism that were kind of like, everywhere in during the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great answer and really interesting, and to a certain extent, I do totally agree. But in another way, I sort of want to sort of push a bit on the point about.
I think it's an interesting point, actually. Like that you, as an American, like I tend to find that most Americans find a lot of alarmism around the term just socialism in general, regardless of its democratic status or not. So I do find it interesting and quite hopeful that you haven't found this problem.
So one dynamic, it took me a while to get, used to the idea of calling myself a socialist and hanging out with socialists, because the Socialist Party in Italy and throughout my youth is like has been an extremely corrupt entity. And there was, a split after the Soviet Revolution. And so like the Communist Party and the Socialist Party sort of like split in a more like, anyway. So like every country, every time, every generation has its own like connotation and history. And I just like came to the conclusion that that's the right thing to do here for this particular context. And keeping in mind that you shouldn't associate sort of like an absolute value to these words. Essentially, it's a label. It's whatever you have at your disposal. And the other thing that happens that you just to connect to what you were saying is that for many years the American right has been assigning this idea, has been throwing this category of socialism to a whole lot of things that are not even socialist. Right? They are like essentially like a welfare state, liberal, and so on. And I think that was maybe like until the 90s was like a particularly good strategy, because you could essentially like red bait,
discredit anything,
discredit pretty much everything. But like I think it backlashed because new generations were much less concerned about the nuclear holocaust after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and never like lived through the Red Scare, and therefore seeing all these good things being labeled as socialism, and having generally more access to information, having friends in Canada, they're like, oh, you have a socialized healthcare. How is that? It's not actually bad. So I think like many people started to think, oh, maybe I'm actually socialist. Maybe there's like goals. So there's like terrible people that are Republicans are sort of like giving me, I'm sort of like identifying myself by opposition to that, and so I think there was a bit of like a judo move in that sense that happened.
Yeah, I mean, talking of
Definitely.
the right and so on with this kind of thing, like it's interesting. You started off by saying, you started making games. I don't know what it was, 2007 or something, or 2003 even. But it's interesting because. Obviously around 2014, so a decade later, you get this kind of the question, like the whole Gamergate thing, and suddenly this kind of like question of like the right in games, and that kind of explodes this kind of like games are. And you described your own like trajectory as like you were radicalized, you said, at a certain point, and it's interesting because games are associated in a certain way with radicalization, but it's always in the other camp, as it were.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of think about that history and in relation to your own sort of socialist radicalization?
Right. It depends how close you are on the sort of like the conversation in games and the gaming community. I think the best way to read Gamergate is as a kind of culture war, obviously, but as a kind of backlash to some changes that were already happening. More specifically, the kind of like the flawed, I wouldn't say even the flawed, like the introduction and the protagonism of women, people of color, increasingly, and queer game designers and game developers sort of like being part of the conversation, and even like companies sort of adapting to that and adapting to some of the baseline liberal niceness of being essentially tolerant toward other people. So that was seen as by hardcore gamers who were used to male-dominated, not even politicized, but just kind of like very male, very dude-oriented community. They saw that sort of like transformation or infiltration as a kind of people are here to take away your toys, or people are here to endanger the last bastion of masculinity that you have left.
Which is strange to think, but yeah, true.
I think even the Gamergaters were actually pretty honest in that. Like it wasn't just like, oh, it just happened. So it was just a reaction to better journalism that was giving more room to more voices. Essentially, that was the main in the very fact that, like, I guess, like the main the first incident that created Gamergate was due to the fact that there was a woman in a game conference, and so
yeah.
Do you think it's one way, Alfie?
Go on.
Can you?
You said that kind of the radicalization you think only goes one way.
No, he said that he thinks that that's sort of the mainstream narrative, right, as opposed to necessarily what he thinks.
I think the mainstream narrative kind of like moved very quickly from games are this like horrible things that causes violence because they are shooters, and mainstream media couldn't see really beyond the first-person shooting paradigm that was dominant in the late 90s through the early 2000s, even though the most popular games were not even shooters. They were like things like The Sims, but so like that was like the mainstream sort of like framing, and obviously the right often like leaned on that whenever they had to find a scapegoat for school shootings and things like that, right? And then we had like a bit of like a quick few years of honeymoon of games maybe can be good, and maybe games can make a better world, and that was like that trend was championed by people like Jay McGonigal. But then like almost immediately after, Gamergate happens, and so like games are go back being kind of like these terrible things full of now they are full of fascists, and then with Trump we sort of realized that there was even like a continuity with that.
No, sorry, this is my child there. My view on this is exactly as you said. I mean, I think that games do. I mean, I suppose where I slightly might differ is I do think games radicalize people to the right, but I think they radicalize people to the left and to capitalism as well. Like, games have a radical impact on the subject who's playing them. Like you mentioned The Sims, which was more popular than some first-person shooters. Like, The Sims would be a good example of something which radically influences the gamer to be pro-capitalist. And then there are other games which radically influence the gamer to be pro-American imperialism or whatever. And so what's often missing in this conversation is the games which encourage you to be on the left, which is why I like your games. But I think that the solution to this debate is not to say, games don't do this, but that they always do this. And so it's just a question of how they do it, right? And what they do it for, I suppose.
Right, yeah.
I think there's also an argument as well of like sometimes, obviously, like The Sims doesn't radicalize you to go and build a pool and then remove the ladder from it while somebody's swimming in it, right? Like, or just set up a room full of ovens. Like those things are just like impractical flights of fantasy that it allows people to explore. I mean, actually, it's something Paolo said there previously as well, is that like. Obviously, a lot of what isn't considered here is games like The Sims, and like a lot of what's not considered as well is like a lot of these flash games online. Like, obviously, what we see now, like what those sort of people were concerned about, these masculine figures that were like, the games are being taken away from us. What they haven't really seen is actually like the female perspective. And that's simply that they have been gaming. They've been playing The Sims. They've been playing these flash games online for the same amount of years as we have. Like, they have the same right to claim that as us. Like, just because these things aren't necessarily but then it comes to the question of who is it produced by, right? And it's like, are they produced by like middle-aged men to manipulate these children, or are they produced by other women with these children in mind?
Right. That's where I guess we get into the industry aspect of it, because you can have I mentioned The Sims because The Sims is the moment in which the gender balance of the gaming community really changes dramatically, right? Like starting from 2000, Absolutely. The very first one, that was the first game that had like 50%. Before that, people tried to make like games for girls with mixed results and things like that. Yes. But starting from The Sims, sort of like that is a possibility that even the industry understands. The problem there is that like you still have a big generational gap of essentially the industry being still like led and dominated by dudes, and still today pretty much at the higher level is still like very much male dominated, even if there are like more and more women and non-binary queer developers that are joining the ranks, but still like it takes a while to get to a position of power, a position of creative sort of like agency, right? And
I like that you use position of power as a term, because that is a really good term.
Right, like we are diversifying the industry, but there will be a bit of an inertia that happens even in the best possible scenario, in the scenario in which the industry doesn't scare away this new different voices.
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is as well is like this tokenistic sort of representation. Like they'll have representation, as in they'll show a female in an advertisement that they paid $100. Like they're massively underpaid. You know what I mean? Like, but they won't hire those people and put those people into those positions of power that would allow them to change the industry in such a way that would allow other people of non-binary, female, whatever, into it. You know what I mean? Like that sort of is what I see as the problem in the industry currently. We just don't have those people currently there.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that, but
I mean, in some of the places.
On the question of representation, no, I mean, I agree with it in certain sense. I mean, yeah, and the question of representation, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so obviously there's representation in terms of like people working in those companies and so on, but there's also representation like in the games themselves. And I definitely have a sort of adverse reaction to these things. Like, I usually find myself suspicious if a game has a strong representation of non-binary, queer, or female, or non-white characters. I always feel like there's something that's going on here when this is happening, rather than something that should be celebrated. But it's interesting. I wonder what Paolo's thoughts are, because also one of the things that you're obviously trying to do in your games they're not really representation. It's not about representation. It's much more on the level of gameplay, right? It's like how to create something which, at the level of play, is on board with a different kind of politics, right? Whereas what we see so often is games which are, let's say woke on the level of representation, but precisely the same as any other game on the level of gameplay or play.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's something that several designers kind of like talked about better than me, to be honest, in the sense of like, you can have like a shooter with like, a great representation and still kind of like a shooter, and you're not really questioning any mechanics. You're not questioning the exploitative, free-to-play monetization systems and so on. So it's, I think from a perspective of a designer, of a game designer, it's interesting to be like, okay, let's say that you have a game and you are now introducing playable female character. Should you have essentially the same gameplay, or should you create a whole different experience for this for example, female character or a character of color going about in the world? It's like, should you have an equivalence? Essentially, should you represent a hypothetical, dream world or utopian world in which you're treated the same? Or should you actually have that sort of like element of criticality? Should you have people that address you in a different way, or like and I think that is kind of like potentially a rich territory to explore if you we're willing to, and it can be also like very I think interesting for the player to be to engage in that role play. But usually the kind of like the default standard operating procedure of the industry is cosmetic, right? Like, and you have a character, and this character is essentially interchangeable with a character like the standard white male dude. So I think that is in regard of the representation. Obviously, if you have a representation within the company, within the entity that produces that cultural product, you can do the latter, right? Like, you can do the other thing in which you are actually talking about what it means to exist in the world or imagine a world from that position, that perspective. So like I do make games that are
Dragon Age.
Go for it.
I remember in Dragon Age 2 they made what was quite a radical step at the time to make everyone bisexual, which is obviously in some terms like it's like a utopian thing, but also on the other, by making everyone bisexual and making there being no difference if your character is male and the other character is male, the other character is female, your female, it actually abolished sexuality in this way. Like, if everyone's bisexual, then no one is, in some sense. There aren't any sexualities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally fine. Like, if it's done, as if it's done, how can I say, like self-consciously, as not as like a way to get away with covering the largest amount of identities and customers, essentially. If it's not like cynically like that, it's like, okay, I want everybody to buy my game and I don't want to do this. I think it's a little bit more suspicious, and it's very likely to also be like a bit awkward in the sense that people will see the awkwardness of it, the inauthenticity of that. But if the Dragon Age origin or whatever that was, where like they had like this idea that in this fantasy world, sure, people are bisexual, and so you can have romance with any other non-playing characters. I think, kudos to them.
No, I think
I think it just suits like the single like case, like where this single horny person is playing this game, right? And like everybody else just is left to feel awkward about it because they're noticing it's like, why is this so horny?
Yeah. Sorry, Alfie. We ended up in identity politics. You wanted to talk about socialism, but you brought up Gamergate.
No, but this is exactly what I want to talk about. No, I wasn't going to make a point really. I really like the way you put this question of like, should we, from the perspective of this games designer, do we make someone like you either erase the difference and every character is the same, or you try to do this. And I really don't know what I think is. I agree with you, it's a rich territory, but like I don't know what's better, because there's something extremely woke about being like, let's get in some trans people and then like make sure that it's told from their perspective as well, like, which totally assumes that trans people don't want to shoot someone in the head with a sniper rifle and so on, which they may very well want to do. And on the other hand, you erase the difference by saying, well, all we are is just a different skin and the experience is basically the same. So I don't know how to get out of this, but I agree with you, it's a great question to think about from the game's perspective. I
think it has to be like a question that is pondered and from the beginning. It's not as like as an expedient.
One reason that they don't make it so that these different things react to you is because it's hard and it takes a lot of time. Also in this Dragon Age game, it wasn't just this question of sexuality. Also, if kind of the whole game was meant to be about the oppression of people that have magic, and if you did any magic in public, you'd be instantly arrested. You were so told in the game, but then you'd go out and actually do it in the game, and nothing would happen to you, because obviously that would be a frustrating experience if you couldn't then use magic in combat situations. But it's this constant kind of gap and difficulty where.
Yeah.
Carry on. I thought you just stopped.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, Nathan was giggling at me.
Yeah, you're so self-conscious. Like, oh, it's okay. I'll pat you on the head. Look right below me.
But because of my internet being bad, I feel like I really need to pay attention to you all, so I can tell when it's happening. And this is actually causing me, whatever. I removed myself from the screen because I was going to switch my phone, and then I was like, I'm the host, and if I click the X button, it might just kill it all. So I'm not going to do that.
Fidgeting with it is not going to help.
But
definitely has to reduce the quality. Doug, you're going to have to edit all this out.
Oh, yeah. No. Bye again, Doug. Anyway, now that Doug's left.
No, it's all good. But no, okay. So I mean, again, I guess we can maybe. But I mean, you said, Paolo, it's gone away from talking about socialism, but it hasn't really, because dealing with these questions of identity politics and so on are like precisely the thing that the left kind of struggles with, and the game community does as well. So like it is kind of working out how to work out this problem of like representation, identity, and so on, like and without sort of falling back into the same kind of problems. Go on, sorry.
So, in a bit of I have a point that have you guys seen the game? It's the name of it has just slipped my mind. But H Bomber Guy did a video on it. It was. Do you remember? It was like the little. Why is the word?
Shit start.
Yeah, I know. Why is the name of the game slipped my mind?
Just we'll circle back in a minute.
Yeah, cool. Pathologic is the name of the game. Pathologic. And that does kind of explore some of these systems in that like it has a number of different characters and all of them play differently. And each of their experiences told differently, essentially. And I wouldn't want to spoil it. But one of the characters is aware of everything that is going on in the story. So this makes obviously the experience break down a little bit in that she's always making meta comments and like it's like, do you remember in Vampire the Masquerade what was the name of the class that was always saying things that would break the fourth wall?
Yeah, the insane people.
Malkavian, I believe it was.
And they're always referencing later events in the game, but they're always referencing it in like a way which is
an insane way.
And so you actually finish the game, you don't understand the references.
Yes. So there's a lot of that going on in Pathological, and so there are some games out there but they are very niche and they are very small teams and they're worked on for long times with very dedicated.
Well, the thing is with mainstream games, instead of kind of having this kind of complicated structure, they're just throwing an insane amount of effort and resources
Technology
into
and
making the graphics look better.
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, now you made me forget my point again. Thanks, Stefan.
Do you know your point?
Well, yeah, so it was that, so these experiences sometimes tell us that these games are going to be hard, and that sort of this representation of everybody in one game, it may not necessarily be an achievable thing.
Yeah,
it's a bit mean.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, it introduces complexities, obviously. I would say, like, in my experience, what I'm trying to do right now, and what I tried to do in the past, is identity is not something that you escape, and you just have, like, to me, it's more useful to think in terms of, like, positionality, where I am in society as, as a white man, white cis man. And that is the sort of like the lived experience I can talk about into some extent, and it's pretty rich as well. It's not like it might be like overexposed in mainstream media, but still, like, you can I think talk about masculinity in a smart way that is not just about the displaying of masculinity or machismo, and so that's what, like, in some games like Unmanned, which is about a day in the life of a drone pilot, is kind of like about even the title sort of like suggests it's about drone pilots and drone warfare, but it's also about the sort of like the falling apart of the war heroism, and the crisis of masculinity, and to some extent through the drone sort of like aspect. That is a bit of a metaphor, but also, like, it is also about drone warfare.
Yeah. Weirdly, I saw an army advert recently that was like, it started off with like a woman, and it was like, oh, you don't think you can do this, but actually you can. And then it like pans around and like there's a robot army, and like she's fighting this robot army.
Yeah.
And it's just like,
I've seen that.
Yeah. Well, I think it does this weird thing where it takes, like she is a Terminator, but like she's also fighting robots. It's wild. It has so many.
I think the thing I wanted to make vis-a-vis Dragon Age 2 versus what kind of Paulo's games is that this kind of Dragon Age 2 had this massive gap between kind of what was meant to be going on with magic and what structurally actually was going on in gameplay. While with something like Oligarchy and McDonalds, kind of, it's not that Paulo wasn't like, now he didn't like write in a text box, now the companies are bad. It's bad when they exploit the world. You're going to exploit the world too in this game.
Yeah.
Rather, because of the structure of the game, you didn't have any choice but to kind of engage in this ruthless kind of global imperialism. Because if not, you'd be outcompeted and you'd lose. But unfortunately, I think that the thing is, it's obviously easy to praise indie devs who do these things, but once you scale things up, and especially when you have all these kind of corporate desires for profit, it's not easy, it's not trivial to kind of engage and produce these systems on a much bigger scale.
Right. Yeah, no, that's you're touching upon something extremely important. Obviously, the bigger the capital, the more conservative from the point of view of risk taking, not necessarily just like you have more obstacles to make something innovative. That is the same in every cultural sort of like industry, really. So to me, there are a few ways to deal with that. One could be that by making small independent games, you have this hope to potentially pioneer some ideas that then they get adopted by mainstream games, mainstream producers. So you have like a sort of like a second hand effect to the world, or at least like to mainstream culture, which is has always been the case in think about music. Like all the cool stuff comes from the underground, but then like pretty quickly can affect mainstream music as well. And I don't think it's bad. It's not necessarily appropriation, or it's not always terrible appropriation. The other way is just be fine with the idea that there is not like the flash gamer or like the phone gamer and the mainstream gamer, that the AAA hardcore gamer that plays only shooters. I don't think there is that thing. I don't think that thing is really happening anymore that much. I think there are most gamers might be playing, like big forever games from World of Warcraft to Overwatch or whatever, but they are also playing small games, in between big match. And so, like, I think the diet of the gamer is much diverse. The gamers are diverse, and there are a whole array of people that are not gamers, that don't consider themselves gamers, that are playing very, very casually, and perhaps are a totally worth target, totally worth kind of audience. People who are not gonna just get the PlayStation 5 when it comes out, but they and possibly they are not interested in that kind of equipment, that kind of experience, because they already kind of know that they will not like it, because they don't have time to spend like 50 hours on one game. They don't have they don't like that kind of mainstream game from an aesthetical point of view, because they know that those games are dumb. And I think that's good. I think that's a good audience for more thoughtful, smaller, more casual experiences. So I don't see this problem of scaling up and trying to make bigger and bigger games as crucial.
I totally agree.
The kind of the gamers community or whatever is, on one level, I think it's kind of more than any other kind of fans of the medium, they're kind of the most aggressive and most demanding, and kind of gamers kind of like, for instance, something like Steam, all reviews on there are user reviews. And so the users have incredible power in kind of dictating what games are received positively and which are received negatively. But also at the same time, gamers are kind of the people that are most intensively exploited. Like, no one spends. There's no version of like a movie which costs you like $500 through like $6 microtransactions, right? But it's true in video games, and there isn't necessarily like even a combination or like a correlation between being like a hardcore intensive gamer and being the most exploited, because some of the most exploited people out there are actually like the kind of whales of casual gamers who just spend more and more and more money on microtransactions. So I think the gaming community is very interesting in this sense of they're very active and they're activist in a certain way, but also intensely exploited, and often kind of their anger or ears is directed in a way which we might think is not very productive.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, sorry, go on, Nathan.
I was just going to say, you were making a point about appropriation before. Did you hear about Donut County? Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's terrible. The entire game basically got stolen by another developer. It was called Whole.io or something. Go buy Donut County, everybody. Go.
I was talking of that. I was just I want to let Paolo go, but I did want to ask you before you go, just to sort of take things right down a notch, if you could just throw out some recommendations or games that were really influential for you, because obviously people are interested in your stuff, and you've been doing it since 2003. So, either give us a few games that you want to recommend, but also what were sort of turning points for you in your career as a gamer that you thought were really interesting or important? Like, what games you?
Yeah, I don't know. They sometimes I point a couple of games that I thought they were turning points to me, but they are like, I would not recommend you to play. One was Theme Park. If you play the McDonald's video game, you can sort of like see it. So Theme Park has this thing. This is Bullfrog, maybe 1990, maybe 6 or something like that. It's like very ancient game. I could play when I was a kid, but it is a management game. You're creating amusement park. And there are some interesting tricks that you can do. Like you can sort of like do things like putting the French fries stand next to the beverage stand, just down, and then make like a one-way street. And then you increase the saltiness of the French fries, and then you water down the soda, and you're like, ha ha ha, this is like fools, right? But in your real life, you are the fool. You are like the little NPC, sort of like moving around in the systems that are beyond your control. And so, like having like a top-down perspective, I thought was like interesting, and it, to me, was like a bit of like the epiphany of like what games can do that other media don't do very well. Another one, like in terms of like kind of like black humor, Postal had like some pretty bizarre ideas. Postal, I think I played like maybe like Postal 2. I don't remember which Postal was, but it is like this early open world in which you are in this like kind of like extremely cartoonish version of America, and everybody's pretty terrible. And there were like some ideas that I thought that were great. Cannon fodder, British thing.
It's strange you bring up Postal, actually. I'm writing an article about Postal at the moment.
Okay, yeah, but I played it like for like maybe an hour or so. And
yeah, I pretty much finished it in like half a day.
To me, that was like, I didn't know that games can be kind of like satirical, I would say. Like, even if it was like super heavy-handed, but it was like, I guess like a South Park type of humor, right? Kind of like extremely cynical and so on. So it's not like it's something I would recommend you to play. If you want to play something that I like that is contemporary, first I have a space here in Pittsburgh that is a kind of like somewhere between an arcade and a gallery called Like, in which I organize pop-up exhibitions centered around a theme. Usually they are, somewhat political, or I try to put as much sort of like social issues as I can. But they're mostly like small independent games, the kind of games that I think people should be playing, especially people who don't play games should be kind of like should be aware of. And so like if you go to like.org, you will have like, I think we are like maybe like 30 exhibitions of small games that are to me good, very good, are organized by different themes. And then, like, if you are a leftist, play Half Earth Socialism that just came out, and it is I think the most ambitious. I'm like slightly professionally jealous that somebody actually pulled it off, because I tried to make a game like that before. It's basically envisioning that is an actual socialism simulator, in that it imagines this world in which you have actually a significant control over the economy. You might say even totalitarian control over the world economy, but that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what is happening in there, and the fact that it's based on rather scientifically sound values and data in a climate simulation. So how to make the world, how to make, and the other thing is that is a game that came out, is basically a companion piece for a book that came out for Verso under the same name, Half Earth Socialism. It's basically a eco-socialist manifesto.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you for that. I mean, I'm just looking at like.org. People should check that out. And obviously, Paolo's work on Malaya Industria and so on, if you haven't already, and all of those recommendations. And thanks so much for sort of joining us tonight, Paolo, and talking about it. We'll send it over to you when it's up. But it's been really, really interesting, and we're fans.
Yeah, it was awesome to get to talk to you, man. No, it was really, really awesome.
Whenever you want.